So why is he a heretic? What was he saying that the church fathers, specifically St. Augustine, found so disagreeable?
Yeah, so Pelagius was very influenced by a movement which is broadly called Neoplatonism. It was essentially a revival around the time of the earliest of the church fathers of Platonic ideas. And one of the big elements here was the ethical system, right? That you could be reunited with the divine, the idea that sort of everything had fallen away from the divine. And I'm not an expert in Neoplatonism, so I'm sure an expert in Neoplatonism would say I'm oversimplifying things, but you get the general idea. Everything sort of fell away from the divine, and it can return to the divine through a sort of spiritual contemplation of the divine. And this influenced Pelagius, in that he was thinking, right, he's trying to Christianize us. And there's a lot of church fathers who Christianize Neoplatonist ideas. So it's not as though we're saying the fact he drew on a non-Christian philosophy was in itself bad, but he took that element of our ability to reunite ourselves with the divine through our own ability. And so he really wanted to emphasize our own ability to get back to God. And there's a grain of truth in there. All heresies start with a grain of truth, right? The church fathers were not saying what Luther and Calvin would later say, and essentially there's no cooperation with grace on our part at all. No, there's cooperation with grace on our part. But Pelagius wanted to emphasize really that human will aspect. And what Augustine found troubling about this is what it makes our relationship with God founded upon something we did rather than something God did. So ultimately then divinization, right, theosis or salvation, that will ultimately be predicated upon Pelagius' system, a choice the human made, versus for Augustine, he says it's predicated on a choice God made. Not that we called ourselves to follow Christ, but that Christ called us to follow him. And this is really gets down to one of the major debates that actually goes on, especially early on in the Pelagian debates, which is on original sin. Now, Pelagius wanted to emphasize that we're not, Adam and Eve, they committed a sin. They are guilty of that sin. But we can't blame someone else for our sin, right? We can't be guilty of someone else's sin. And there's many passages in scripture that do state that. And so they thought then, well, we can't be guilty of Adam and Eve's sin. So therefore, we're essentially not born fallen, right? We're born, Adam and Eve were spiritual infants. So we're likewise born as spiritual infants. And it's when we start committing sins in this world, that's what separates us from God. Versus for Augustine, he says, no, we would have naturally been born into that relationship with God. We wouldn't have been tempted to sin. But he points out that from the earliest days of our life, we are tempted towards sin. He actually talks about this in the Confessions, where he talks about how as a baby even, he was this great sinner, right? Because even though he didn't personally choose to commit sins, he's not talking about in that sense that he was committing something and guilty of it, but that his actions were not rightly ordered, right? He should have naturally obeyed his parents, that before the fall, even infants would have naturally obeyed their parents. But he says he sits there all day crying and commanding his parents to be slaves of him, which is the wrong ordering of things. Or when he grows up as a school child and he wants to avoid doing his work and has to be beaten to be made to do his homework, essentially. And that this is a sinful thing that was in him from the earliest days of his life that had to be corrected. And so he sees essentially that no, humans, even infants, are not in a proper relationship with God. And he sees that the solution to this, the sacrament of baptisms, the sacrament of baptism is for the remission of sins. I see this many times in scripture and in many creeds of the church. Right in the Nicene Creed, I believe in one baptism for the remission of sins. And he pointed out that the church baptizes infants, and the church wouldn't baptize infants for the remission of sins if those infants did not in fact have sin. And so that's his primary concern against Pelagius, is that no, these infants really do have sin. And since they're born separated from God, they're going to need an additional gift of grace by God to bring them back into that relationship. And even before baptism, we'll call them the preparatory graces, I think what later commentators call them, that God gives us the ability in the first place to believe, right? Faith is a theological virtue. It's a gift from God. It's not simply a natural virtue that we get from simply being human, but something God gives to us. And so Augustine points out that we couldn't have even believed in the first place if God hadn't first given us the gift of faith, so that we could then go to the sacrament of baptism to be baptized and have our original sin removed and be in a right relationship with God.